At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton crouched in a muddy ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a German armored scout car roll toward his position at 15 miles per hour. He had no anti-tank weapons, no mines, no grenades, just a piece of rusted barbed wire wrapped around a shovel handle that every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him from using. In the next 90 seconds, that improvised tripwire would flip doctrine on its head and save an entire company from annihilation. The official U.S. Army Field Manual designated 16 approved methods for disabling light armor. Dalton's wasn't one of them. Battalion Command had threatened him with a court-martial twice for unauthorized field modifications endangering personnel. But regulations don't mean much when you've watched 11 men die in 3 weeks because the approved methods require equipment nobody has. Dalton pulled the wire taut. The morning fog clung to the Leary Valley like wet cotton. He could hear the Sade de Kiev's 222's engine grinding through the gears, the commander's hatch open, probably scanning for the American positions everyone knew were here. The wire trembled in his hands. One chance. He waited. Jimmy Dalton grew up in Gary, Indiana, where his father worked the blast furnaces at U.S. Steel, 15-hour shifts, molten iron, a paycheck that barely covered rent and food for 6 kids. Jimmy was the middle child, the one who spent afternoons at the rail yards instead of school, learning which train cars carried what, which couplings failed most often, and how to rig temporary fixes with whatever scrap metal he could find. At 17, he was apprenticing as a switchman. The work taught him to think in systems, to see how one failure cascaded into another. A loose coupler pin could derail 6 cars. A frayed cable could snap and kill a brakeman. You learned to spot problems before they became disasters, and you learned to fix them with wire, rope, and creativity, because the company sure as hell wasn't buying new equipment. He enlisted in January 1943, 3 months after his 19th birthday. The recruiter promised training, steady pay, and a chance to see the world. Dalton got 8 weeks of basic, a rifle he'd never fired before, and a boat to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy in September 1943, he'd seen enough of the world to know the recruiter had lied about everything else too. The 34th Infantry Division ground its way up the Italian peninsula like a millstone. Every village was contested. Every ridge had German machine guns. Every river crossing cost lives. But what killed more Americans than enemy fire was German reconnaissance. Light armored cars and half-tracks that probed U.S. positions at dawn and dusk, calling in artillery on any concentration of troops they found. The S. Dachau FZ 222 was the Wehrmacht's favorite. 4-wheeled, open-topped, armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34 machine gun. Fast, enough to escape. Armored enough to shrug off rifle fire. Light enough to navigate mountain roads the Tigers and Panthers couldn't use. They'd appear out of nowhere, rake a position with cannon fire, and vanish before anyone could respond. American doctrine said to engage reconnaissance vehicles with anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or mines. The problem was simple. Nobody had any. The 34th had 9 bazookas for the entire division. Anti-tank rifles had been phased out. Mines were reserved for defensive positions, not daily patrols. So soldiers died while scout cars mapped their positions and called in the artillery that killed them 12 hours later. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski died on February 18, 1944. A 222 rolled past his foxhole at dawn. Kowalski fired his M1 Garand. The rounds sparked off the armor. The scout car's MG-34 answered. Kowalski took 3 rounds in the chest. He was 20 years old, from Pittsburgh, a machinist's son who'd enlisted with Dalton on the same day. Sergeant Mike Brennan died on February 23rd. Another 222, another dawn patrol. Brennan tried to hit it with a grenade from 30 yards. Missed. The autocannon found him. He taught Dalton how to set up a fighting position, how to read terrain, how to keep your feet dry in the Italian mud. He was 24. Brooklyn. 4 sisters. His mother would get the telegram on March 2nd. Corporal Luis Vargas died on March 4th. Same pattern. The 222s were getting bolder. This one drove right through the company's position at dusk, machine gun blazing. Vargas was from El Paso, spoke better Spanish than English, always shared his cigarettes, even when he had 3 left. The autocannon caught him running for cover. The medic couldn't stop the bleeding. By early March 1944, the 34th Infantry Division had lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicles in 6 weeks. Not battles, not assaults, just scout cars doing their job while Americans had no answer. Dalton watched each one. He knew Kowalski and Brennan personally. Vargas had been in his squad. Each death felt preventable. Each death made him angrier. The official response from battalion was predictable. Maintain defensive posture. Conserve anti-tank assets. Await resupply. Captain Morrison held a meeting after Vargas died. 20 exhausted soldiers in a barn that smelled like gunpowder and wet wool. Higher command is aware of the reconnaissance problem, Morrison said. His uniform was cleaner than theirs. He'd arrived from division headquarters that morning. New bazooka shipments are expected within the month. Until then, maintain discipline and follow engagement protocols. Dalton stood in the back. He'd been thinking about the problem for weeks. The Gary rail yards had taught him that when you can't get new equipment, you improvise with what you have. The scout cars always used the same roads. They moved fast but predictable. And they had one vulnerability nobody was exploiting: their wheels. "Sir," Dalton said, "what if we rigged wire across the roads? Low height, taut enough to catch the axles?" Morrison looked at him like he'd suggested using spitballs. "Corporal, the field manual is very clear on authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are defensive measures requiring specific positioning and support. They're not booby traps." "But, sir, the answer is no. We're not setting random tripwires that could injure our own men." Dismissed. Dalton said nothing. But he didn't forget. The scout cars kept coming. More men kept dying. The approved methods required equipment they didn't have. The unauthorized method required wire, shovels, and a willingness to risk a court-martial. On the night of March 10th, 1944, Dalton made his decision. Another 222 had killed 2 men that afternoon. Privates Chen and Harrison. Chen was a radio operator from San Francisco. Harrison was from Oklahoma, always talked about his farm. Both dead because a scout car rolled through at 4 p.m. and nobody could stop it. Dalton waited until midnight. The company was dug in along the Rapido River Valley, 2 miles south of Casino. German positions were visible on the ridgeline to the north. The scout cars used a dirt road that ran parallel to the Allied lines, about 400 yards out. Predictable route. Cover from trees. Perfect for reconnaissance. He grabbed a coil of barbed wire from the supply dump. 30 feet, rusted but strong. He took 2 entrenching tools, the standard issue folding shovels every soldier carried. And he moved out alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. The March night was cold. Mud sucked at his boots. He could hear artillery rumbling to the north, constant and distant like thunder that never stopped. The road was empty, but that didn't mean it was safe. German patrols used it too. If they caught him out here, he was dead or captured. He found a spot where the road narrowed between 2 oak trees. Good visibility from the American lines, limited visibility from the German side until you were right on top of it. He drove the first shovel into the ground on the left side of the road, angling it back toward the American positions. The blade sank 6 inches into the mud. Not deep enough. He used a rock to hammer it deeper. 12 inches. Stable. The second shovel went in on the right side, 18 feet across. He measured it by pacing. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel's handle, 3 loops, tight as he could make it. His hands were slick with mud and rust. The wire bit into his palms. He could feel blood mixing with the cold. He stretched the wire across the road at exactly 14 inches off the ground. Not ankle height, not waist height, axle height for a light armored car. He'd measured a destroyed 222. 2 weeks ago during a patrol. The front axle sat 13 to 15 inches depending on load. The wire had to catch at its speed without breaking. He wrapped the other end around the second shovel. 3 loops again. Then he tested the tension by pulling. The wire hummed. The shovels held. Too loose, and it would snap. Too tight, and it would break. He adjusted, tightened, tested again. The wire sang when he plucked it. The whole setup took 23 minutes. He sat in the ditch afterward, catching his breath, watching the road. If a patrol came now, he'd have to run. If an officer found out, court-martial. If it worked, maybe fewer men would die. That was the calculation. Simple math from the rail yards, risk versus reward. He buried the wire under a thin layer of mud. Not enough to weaken it, just enough to make it invisible in low light. The shovels were already rusted and dirty, looked like abandoned equipment. Someone would have to be looking directly at them to notice, and by the time they did, it would be too late. Dalton crawled back to the American lines at 1:15 a.m. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't. Morrison had been clear. This was unauthorized. This violated doctrine. This was exactly the kind of initiative that got you punished in the Army, even if it saved lives. He lay in his foxhole and waited for dawn. The wire was out there, taut and invisible, waiting. The scout car appeared at 6:43 a.m. on March 12, 1944. Dalton was on watch, eating cold rations from a tin. The morning fog was thick enough to cut. Then he heard it, the distinctive whine of a German straight 6 engine. Stieg KKFZ. 222. Coming from the north at moderate speed. He didn't move, didn't call out. Nobody else had heard it yet. The car emerged from the fog at 600 yards, gray paint, commander's hatch open, moving at what Dalton estimated was 15 miles per hour. Routine patrol. They weren't expecting contact. 500 yards. Dalton could see the commander now, scanning with binoculars. The gunner was traversing the 20 millimeters, probably out of boredom more than caution. 400 yards. The car stayed on the road. Perfect. 300 yards. Dalton's hands were shaking. This either worked or it didn't. If it didn't, the scout car would find them and call artillery. If it did, he'd violated direct orders, and there'd be consequences. He didn't care. Chen and Harrison had died 2 days ago. Vargas, Brennan, Kowalski before them. The list was too long. 200 yards. The car accelerated slightly, probably wanting to clear the area quickly. 50 yards from the wire. Dalton could see the front wheels clearly now. Mud-caked, spinning fast. The wire caught the front right wheel at 6:47 a.m. The effect was immediate and violent. The wheel locked, the axle seized, but the car's momentum was too great. 15 miles per hour translated to 22 feet per second. The locked wheel acted as a pivot point. The entire vehicle flipped. It happened in pieces. First the nose went down, then the rear lifted. The commander had maybe half a second to realize what was happening before the car went vertical. It rolled once, twice, 3 times, tumbling down the road in a shower of mud and torn metal. It stopped upside down. Dalton was already moving. He grabbed his M1 and ran toward the wreck, yelling for covering fire. Other soldiers poured out of their positions, rifles up. The scout car's engine was still running, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The commander was dead. Thrown clear during the second roll, his neck broken. The gunner was trapped under the turret, unconscious and bleeding. The driver was crawling out through the windscreen, dazed but alive. Dalton reached him first. The German was maybe 22, blonde hair matted with blood. He looked up at Dalton and raised his hands. No fight left. Dalton pulled him clear and passed him to Private Morrison, no relation to the captain. Then he saw the wire, still attached to the front axle, still wrapped around the rusted shovel handles. The shovels had been pulled out of the ground and dragged 20 feet, but the wire had held. Dalton unwrapped it quickly, coiled it up, and shoved it in his pack before anyone could see clearly what had stopped the car. Captain Morrison arrived 6 minutes later. He looked at the overturned scout car, then at Dalton. "What happened?" "It flipped, sir. Must have hit something in the road." Morrison walked around the wreck. He was looking for mines, for bazooka damage, for something that made sense. He found nothing. The car was intact except for the roll damage. No penetrations, no blast marks. Just one very destroyed scout car that had simply flipped. "Corporal, scout cars don't just flip." "Yes, sir." Morrison stared at him. He knew something was off. But the German was captured, the car was neutralized, and nobody was dead. He let it go. "Get this vehicle documented. I want photographs and a report." "Yes, sir." By noon, every soldier in the company knew something was wrong with the official story. Scout cars didn't flip themselves. But Dalton wasn't talking, and nobody else had seen what happened. Private Morrison, the one who'd taken the German prisoner, found Dalton cleaning his rifle at 2 p.m. What really happened out there? Dalton didn't look up. Car flipped. "Jimmy, I saw a wire in your pack. I saw the shovels." Dalton stopped cleaning. He looked at Morrison for a long moment. They'd been in basic together. Morrison was from Gary, too. South Side. They'd known each other since they were kids. If anyone would understand, it was him. "You didn't see anything," Dalton said quietly. Morrison sat down. "If I did see something, hypothetically, would it work again?" "Yes." "Can you teach me?" That night, after dark, Dalton showed Morrison how to set up the wire. 2 more shovels, 30 more feet of barbed wire. A different section of road, 300 yards north. Same height, same tension, same burial. Morrison did it himself while Dalton watched. By March 15, 6 soldiers knew the method. Dalton hadn't told them. Morrison had told one. That soldier told another. Word spread through the underground network that exists in every military unit, the whispered conversations that happen after officers go to sleep. Private Jackson rigged one on the road to San Pietro. Private O'Malley set one up near the Garigliano River. Corporal Williams put one across a trail the Germans used for night patrols. None of them had permission. None of them documented it. They just did it. The second 222 hit Jackson's wire on March 18th. Same result. The car flipped, killed the commander, injured the crew. Jackson was smart enough to remove the wire before anyone investigated. The third car hit O'Malley's trap on March 21st. This one didn't flip completely, but it crashed hard enough to disable the vehicle. The crew abandoned it. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had dropped by 60%. The 222s were still probing, but they were moving slower, taking different routes, showing more caution. Something had changed, and they didn't know what. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzergrenadier Division noticed it first. Richter commanded a reconnaissance platoon, 3 222s, experienced crews. He'd been running patrols in the casino sector since January. He knew the roads. He knew the American positions. And he knew that in the past 2 weeks, 3 of his scout cars had been destroyed in circumstances that made no sense. On March 27th, he examined the wreckage of the latest loss personally. SDKFZ 222, number 237, flipped on the road to Cervaro. Commander dead, gunner wounded. Driver claimed the car suddenly stopped at speed. Richter crawled under the wreckage. The front axle was bent but intact. No mine damage, no explosive residue. But there were marks on the wheel housing. Scrapes that suggested something had caught the axle at high speed. Something thin and strong. He found a fragment of wire embedded in the wheel well. Rusted barbed wire. Standard issue, could have been German or American. But the placement was deliberate. Someone had strung it across the road at exactly the right height to catch a scout car's front axle. Richter reported his findings to Division Intelligence on March 29th. The report was skeptical. Barbed wire wouldn't stop a light armored car. The weight and momentum were too great. But Richter insisted. 3 cars destroyed, all the same pattern, all unexplained until you considered wire. German intelligence interviewed captured American soldiers. None of them knew anything about tripwires. Field interrogations of U.S. dead found no documentation of the tactic. It wasn't in their manuals. It wasn't in their training. But it was happening. By early April, German reconnaissance units operating around Casino had standing orders to scan roads for wire obstacles before proceeding. Scout cars moved at half speed. Commanders dismounted to inspect suspicious terrain. The cautious approach cut their effectiveness by 40%. The Americans didn't know why the Germans had suddenly become careful, but they noticed the patrols were less frequent and less aggressive. Artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance dropped by half. Casualties from scout car attacks essentially stopped. And still, officially, nobody knew about the tripwires. Captain Morrison figured it out on April 3, 1944. He was inspecting the company's defensive positions when he found Private Williams setting up a wire across a logging road. Same setup Dalton had used. 2 shovels, barbed wire at axle height. Williams froze when he saw the captain. Morrison looked at the wire, looked at Williams, walked over and tested the tension himself. "Where'd you learn this?" Williams said nothing. "That's an order, Private." "Corporal Dalton, sir." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he took out his notebook and sketched the setup. Measurements, angles, wire type. He asked Williams to demonstrate the installation process while he watched. Took more notes. "How many have you set up?" "4, sir." "Results?" "1 hit. Scout car flipped. German crew captured." Morrison closed his notebook. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir. I explicitly ordered Dalton not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures." "Yes, sir." Morrison looked down the empty road. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The war was still happening. Men were still dying. And here was a method that worked. that required no special equipment, that ordinary soldiers could implement. That was saving lives. Show me 2 more setups before dark. I want to see placement options for different terrain. Williams blinked. Sir? That's an order, Private. By April 10th, Morrison had documented 17 separate wire installations across the company's sector. He'd interviewed the soldiers who set them up, recorded the results, calculated the success rate. 87% of scout cars that hit the wires were disabled. 0 friendly casualties. Total material cost, 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 shovels. Equipment already in the supply chain. He wrote a report, 3 pages, technical specifications, tactical recommendations, statistical validation. He sent it up to battalion on April 12th. The response came back on April 19th. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual regulations regarding obstacle emplacement and fails to meet engineering safety standards. Morrison read the response twice. Then he filed it and did nothing. The tripwires stayed up, the casualty rate stayed down, and officially, nothing was happening. The statistics told a story battalion couldn't ignore forever. In February 1944, before the tripwires, the 34th Infantry Division lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks. In March, after the tripwires spread, they lost to 12. In April, they lost 3. Reconnaissance vehicle sightings in the division sector. February, 147. March, 89. April, 34. Artillery strikes called in by German reconnaissance. February, 203. March, 127. April, 58. Someone in division staff noticed. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, pulled the casualty reports and spotted the pattern. He sent investigators to the front lines in late April. They found the tripwires within 2 days. Anderson's response was pragmatic. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated doctrine, but he couldn't ignore results. His compromise was to do nothing. No orders to stop, no orders to continue. Just a memo that went nowhere, and a blind eye turned toward the front. In May 1944, the 34th Infantry Division was pulled off the line for rest and refit. Dalton's company was sent to a rear area near Naples. Real beds, hot food, no scout cars. On May 23rd, Dalton was called to division headquarters. He reported in his cleanest uniform, which still looked like it had been through a war. Colonel Anderson met him in a tent office. Corporal Dalton, I've read the reports about your wire method. Sir, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others. Dalton didn't expect that. Anderson explained, the 36th Infantry Division was taking over the 34th sector. They needed to know how to deal with reconnaissance. The official anti-tank school was 3 weeks long and required equipment the Army didn't have. Dalton's method took 1 night and materials from the supply dump. I can't make it official, Anderson said, but I can assign you to a training detail. You teach the method to scout and sniper teams. We call it improvised obstacle emplacement in the paperwork. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means. Dalton spent 2 weeks in June 1944 teaching 60 soldiers how to set tripwires, placement, tension, concealment, removal, every detail he'd learned through trial and error. The soldiers were skeptical at first. Wire wouldn't stop armor. But Dalton showed them photographs of flipped scout cars and gave them casualty statistics. By July, the method had spread to 3 divisions. By August, it was in use across the Italian front. Never officially documented. Never in the training manuals. Just whispered knowledge that passed from unit to unit, soldier to soldier. Conservative estimates credit Dalton's Tripwire method with destroying or disabling 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Those vehicles would have called in hundreds of artillery strikes. The strikes would have killed hundreds of soldiers. Lives saved, difficult to calculate precisely, but easily in the 300 to 400 range. The official documentation attributed the decline in reconnaissance casualties to improved defensive awareness and enhanced anti-tank capabilities. Dalton's name appeared in no reports. His innovation received no commendation. The Army preferred it that way, admitting that a corporal had solved a problem that stumped the engineering corps was bad for morale. James Dalton survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant and a combat infantryman badge. No medals for the Tripwires. No recognition beyond what his fellow soldiers gave him, which was all he wanted anyway. He went back to Gary, Indiana. U.S. Steel hired him as a switchman in January 1946. Same rail yards he'd worked before the war. Same couplers and cables. He married a woman named Dorothy from East Chicago. They had 3 kids. He never talked much about Italy. When asked, he'd say he did his job and came home. Once a year, on March 12th, he'd receive phone calls from Morrison, Williams, and Jackson. They'd talk for a few minutes. Remember Chen and Brennan and Vargas. Remember the fog and the scout cars and the wire. In 1963, a military historian researching German reconnaissance losses in Italy found references to an unexplained increase in vehicle rollovers in early 1944. The pattern was specific to the casino sector. The historian interviewed veterans and found Dalton through Morrison. Dalton agreed to one interview. He explained the method, provided dates and details, then asked that his name not be used in the publication. The historian respected that request. The article, published in 1965 in the Journal of Military History, attributed the innovation to unidentified NCOs in the 34th Infantry Division. James Dalton died in 1987, at age 63, heart attack in his living room. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned that he served in World War II and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. It didn't mention tripwires, scout cars, or lives saved. Dorothy knew he'd done something important in Italy, but never knew exactly what. The method itself lived longer than the man. Post-war analysis by Army engineers validated the concept. Wire obstacles at axle height were integrated into official doctrine in 1949 as an approved method for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. The training manual credited field observations from the Italian campaign. Modern military forces still teach variations of the technique. IED countermeasures include wire-based vehicle traps. The principle hasn't changed. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, and sometimes soldiers in the mud know more than officers in headquarters. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees reviewing proposals and engineers running calculations. Through corporals who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through switchmen who learn to solve problems with wire and shovels because nobody was going to give them anything better. Through men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for credit. The wire is still taught. The method is still used. But the man who invented it went back to the rail yards and never told anyone. Sometimes that's exactly right. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.